If someone had told me that the man I hired to fix my house would be the one to break my marriage, I'd have laughed and handed them a wrench. Turns out, some repairs can't be patched up with drywall and paint. Apparently, the only thing my wife wanted remodeled was her commitment to me. I'm Nick, 38, an IT manager who spends more time solving network issues than paying attention to the cracks forming in my own life. My wife, Emma, 35, is a real estate agent, charming and ambitious, with a knack for selling the dream of the perfect home. We've been married for 12 years and live in a modest but cozy house in the suburbs, a house that had started to show its age over the past few years. It all began when we decided to renovate our kitchen. Emma had been pushing for it for months, saying it would increase the value of the house and make her more excited to cook. I didn't argue. The kitchen was outdated, and a remodel seemed like a reasonable investment. We hired Mark, a local contractor with glowing reviews and a portfolio full of impressive before and after photos. He was confident, professional, and seemed to know exactly what we wanted. At first, everything seemed fine. Mark showed up on time, communicated clearly, and even offered suggestions that made the project feel exciting. Emma loved his enthusiasm and took charge of the details, working closely with him to choose countertops, fixtures, and paint colors. I thought it was great. She was happy, the work was progressing smoothly, and I didn't have to stress over the small stuff. But then little things started to feel off. Mark began staying later than usual, sometimes well into the evening. Emma insisted it was because he was a perfectionist and wanted to make sure everything was just right. She'd gush about how dedicated he was, how he went above and beyond to ensure the project's success. I told myself she was right, that it was better to have someone who cared about the details than someone rushing to finish. But then there were the moments I couldn't ignore. One evening, I came home earlier than expected from work and found Emma and Mark sitting at the kitchen table, laughing over what looked like an inside joke. The atmosphere shifted the moment I walked in. Emma's laughter abruptly stopped, and Mark quickly stood, grabbing his tools and muttering something about finishing up for the day. Emma waved it off, saying they'd just been discussing design options, but the way she avoided my eyes made my chest tighten. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more. Emma began dressing up a little more than usual, even on days when she didn't have showings. Her phone, which had always been an open book, was suddenly glued to her side, and her texts were filled with emojis and laughter that didn't match the professional tone she'd always had with clients. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the unease in my gut grew stronger with every passing day. The breaking point came when I overheard a conversation between Emma and Mark. I'd come home early again, my meeting canceled at the last minute, and heard voices in the backyard. Peeking through the blinds, I saw them standing close together, their heads tilted toward each other as they talked in low tones. I couldn't make out the words, but the way Emma touched his arm, the way Mark leaned in, it wasn't professional. I didn't confront them that day. Instead, I decided to start paying closer attention. I began noting how often Mark was at the house, how late he stayed, and how Emma's demeanor changed when he was around. The cracks in our marriage, the ones I'd ignored for so long, were starting to feel like chasms. After that evening in the backyard, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Emma and Mark's interactions didn't sit right with me. The way they laughed, the subtle touches, the unspoken familiarity. I told myself I might be imagining things, but every instinct screamed that there was more to their relationship than she let on. I started noticing the small details. Mark's schedule became inconsistent. Some days he arrived hours late, only to linger well into the evening. Emma would brush it off, saying he was juggling multiple projects or dealing with unexpected delays. She praised his dedication, often going on about how much he cared about getting every detail just right. But it was the way she spoke about him, her tone warmer than it should have been, that made my stomach churn. One Friday, I decided to work from home. Emma was out for a showing, and Mark was scheduled to finish some work on the cabinets. I stayed in my office, trying to focus on my tasks, but my mind kept drifting to the kitchen. Around lunchtime, I stepped out to grab a coffee and noticed Mark sitting at the counter, casually eating a sandwich he must have brought with him. I nodded at him, muttered a polite hello, and went back to work, though my unease lingered. Later that afternoon, as I walked through the house, I noticed Emma's favorite water bottle sitting on the counter. One I'd seen her take with her every day for as long as I could remember. It was an expensive stainless steel bottle, engraved with her initials, something she never left behind. It struck me as odd, given how meticulous Emma was about always having it with her. Mark noticed me looking at it and said, "Oh, she forgot it here the other day." The way he said it was casual, almost too casual, and it stopped me in my tracks. Emma hadn't mentioned leaving anything behind, and considering how rarely Mark was at the house without me around, his comment didn't make sense. I let it slide for the moment, but the unease in my chest grew stronger. That evening, when Emma returned home, I asked her if she'd forgotten anything at the house recently. She hesitated for a moment before shrugging it off, saying she must have left the bottle when she'd stopped by to check on progress. But her answer didn't match the timeline. Why hadn't she mentioned it? And why was she even there when Mark was supposed to be working alone? I decided to keep digging. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to the patterns I'd overlooked before. Emma's schedule seemed to align suspiciously with Mark's visits. She'd often stop by to see how the work was going, staying for long stretches even when I wasn't around. The casual excuse of her checking in didn't add up anymore. The breaking point came when I noticed something tucked inside Emma's tote bag. She had left it on the couch after coming home one evening, and as I reached to move it aside, a small notebook slipped out. I wasn't planning to snoop, but the corner of a photograph sticking out from between the pages caught my eye. It was a Polaroid of Emma and Mark, smiling together in what looked like a storage room. The background was cluttered with tools and supplies, and Emma was holding up a piece of backsplash tile like it was a trophy. Mark's arm was slung casually around her shoulders, his grin too familiar, too comfortable. I flipped through the notebook and found a few more Polaroids, all of them taken in our house, documenting the renovation progress. Or at least that's how it seemed. But the poses, the smiles, the candid nature of the photos, they weren't just professional. There was something deeply personal about them, something that made my stomach twist. One of the photos had a date scribbled on the back. Last Thursday, perfect progress. The problem was, last Thursday Emma had told me she was stuck at a property showing all afternoon. I couldn't look at her the same way after that. Every time she smiled at me, every time she casually mentioned the renovation or praised Mark's work, I felt a surge of anger and betrayal. She didn't know I'd found the photos. She didn't know I was beginning to piece it all together. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction, every excuse, every suspicious moment in my mind. The evidence was stacking up, and the picture it painted wasn't just of a contractor doing his job. It was of a man who had inserted himself into my life and taken something that wasn't his to take. I wasn't ready to confront Emma yet. I needed more, something undeniable that she couldn't talk her way out of. The Polaroids were damning, but I wanted the full truth. And if she thought she could keep hiding it, she was wrong. I couldn't keep the photos to myself any longer. Every time I saw Emma laughing or scrolling on her phone, the Polaroids flashed in my mind like neon signs screaming betrayal. The casual nature of the images, the familiarity in their smiles, it was eating me alive. I needed answers, and I needed them now. That evening, as Emma sat at the kitchen table reviewing paperwork for her latest property listing, I placed the Polaroid on the counter in front of her. She froze mid-sentence, her eyes flicking to the photo before darting back to mine. For a brief second, her face was unreadable, a mix of surprise, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite pin down. "What's this about?" I asked, my voice calm but firm, keeping my emotions in check. Emma quickly composed herself, picking up the photo and giving it a brief glance before shrugging. "It's just a photo," she said, her tone light, as though it was a picture of her and a friend at a party rather than her and Mark standing too close in a room where they shouldn't have been together. I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. The tension in the air was thick, and I could tell she was choosing her words carefully. She explained that the photo had been taken during one of her check-ins on the progress of the kitchen. According to her, Mark had been enthusiastic about documenting the renovation process and thought it would be fun to snap a few pictures. She claimed there was nothing more to it, a simple, harmless moment captured on film. But her explanation didn't sit right with me. The way she dismissed the photo so casually, the The way her eyes avoided mine as she spoke, it all felt rehearsed, like she prepared for this moment long before I confronted her. When I pressed her further, Emma's tone shifted. She reassured me that there was absolutely nothing going on between her and Mark, emphasizing that their relationship was purely professional. She admitted that the photo might look a bit too friendly, but insisted it was innocent, a moment taken out of context. To my surprise, she offered a solution. If it makes you uncomfortable, we can hire another contractor to finish the job. Her suggestion caught me off guard. It was the kind of proactive response I didn't expect, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd been reading too much into everything. But then, I thought about all the other red flags, the late nights, the missing water bottle, the text from Mark, and the familiarity I'd seen between them time and time again. The photo wasn't the beginning or the end. It was just another piece of a much larger puzzle. I told Emma I'd think about her suggestion, and she nodded, her relief palpable. She seemed eager to move on from the conversation, diving back into her work as though nothing had happened. But her reaction only deepened my suspicions. If there was truly nothing going on, why would she offer to replace Mark so quickly? That night, I lay awake, replaying the conversation in my mind. Emma had done everything right on the surface. She'd stayed calm, provided an explanation, and even suggested a way to ease my discomfort. But something about the way she handled it felt wrong. Her words were too smooth, her demeanor too controlled, as if she'd been expecting this confrontation and had already decided how to handle it. I decided to give it a few days before making any decisions. If Emma thought she'd reassured me, if she thought her explanation had erased my doubts, she was mistaken. I'd spent years trusting her, believing in the strength of our marriage. But now, that trust was fractured, and I needed more than her words to mend it. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention to Emma and Mark. True to her word, Emma started looking for another contractor, reaching out to local businesses and requesting quotes. On the surface, it seemed like she was serious about easing my concerns. But her behavior didn't change. She still lingered near Mark when he was working, still laughed a little too hard at his jokes, still looked at him with an ease that made my stomach churn. Mark, for his part, seemed unaffected by the conversation I'd had with Emma. He continued showing up late, staying later than necessary, and treating our home like his personal hangout. He didn't seem to notice, or care, that my demeanor toward him had grown colder. One afternoon, as I returned home early from work, I found Mark in the living room, standing by the bookshelf and flipping through one of Emma's favorite novels. Emma was sitting on the couch, her journal open on her lap, chatting with him like they were old friends. The sight of them together, so comfortable and at ease, made my blood boil. When Mark noticed me, he quickly set the book down and mumbled something about getting back to work. Emma glanced up, her smile faltering for just a moment before she asked how my day had been. I gave a curt reply, my eyes lingering on the space between them, the space that felt too close. That night, I couldn't hold back any longer. If Emma thought she could smooth this over with reassurances and half-truths, she was wrong. I needed to get to the bottom of this, and I wasn't going to let her distract me with polite words or easy solutions. Things between Emma and me had seemingly settled into a cautious truce. She found a replacement contractor, and Mark was scheduled to finish the last of his work by the end of the week. On the surface, everything looked fine. Her reassurances, her willingness to address my concerns, and her sudden shift toward being more present in our marriage. For a brief moment, I let myself believe that perhaps I'd been wrong, that maybe she'd been telling the truth all along. But life has a funny way of revealing the truth when you least expect it. I was scheduled to leave for a 3-day business trip, one that had been planned for weeks. Emma kissed me goodbye that morning, her demeanor warm and cheerful, as if the tension of the past few weeks had finally dissipated. She even joked about finishing some projects around the house while I was away. I left, feeling lighter than I had in days, cautiously optimistic that we might be able to move forward. Fate, however, had other plans. The trip was cut short unexpectedly due to a client cancellation. By sheer coincidence, I returned home the very next evening, far earlier than Emma anticipated. It was late when I pulled into the driveway, the house dark except for a faint glow coming from the bedroom window. I grabbed my bag and headed inside, eager to surprise her with my early return. The first thing I noticed was the mess. Mark's shoes were by the door, his distinctive, worn-out work boots that he always left neatly outside. They were carelessly tossed next to Emma's flats, a glaringly intimate arrangement that made my chest tighten. As I moved further into the house, I saw his clothes draped over a chair in the living room, his jacket casually thrown across the armrest. My stomach churned, the reality of what was happening dawning on me with each step. I froze when I reached the stairs, noticing a trail of Emma's clothing leading up to the bedroom. Her sweater, her skirt, and finally, a piece of lingerie I didn't even recognize. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, opening the camera app to document everything. If I was wrong, I told myself, I'd delete the photos. But deep down, I already knew the truth. When I reached the bedroom door, it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The sight that greeted me was both surreal and devastating. Emma was in bed, tangled in the sheets with Mark. They were asleep, their bodies entwined in an embrace that left no room for doubt. Mark's arm was draped possessively over her waist, his face buried in her hair, while Emma's head rested on his chest. The intimacy between them was undeniable, a stark contrast to the lies she'd been feeding me for weeks. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, my mind racing. I wanted to scream, to wake them up and demand answers, but I knew better. This wasn't the time for confrontation. This was the time for action. I lifted my phone and began recording, capturing every detail. The clothes strewn about the room, the way they clung to each other in their sleep, the betrayal etched into every inch of the scene. My hands trembled as I filmed, the weight of what I was witnessing threatening to overwhelm me. Once I had all the evidence I needed, I quietly backed out of the room and made my way downstairs. I couldn't stay in that house, not after what I'd just seen. I grabbed my bag and drove to a nearby hotel, my mind a whirlwind of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. Lying in that hotel room, staring at the evidence on my phone, the full extent of Emma's betrayal finally hit me. This wasn't just a mistake or a moment of weakness. This was a calculated, deliberate choice she'd made, a choice that shattered everything I thought we'd built together. The trust was gone, and there was no getting it back. The morning after I caught Emma with Mark, I sat in the quiet of the hotel room, staring at my phone. The evidence was undeniable. Photos, videos, and the shattered reality of what I'd seen. Every image, every moment I'd captured told the story Emma had tried so hard to keep hidden. I knew what I needed to do, but the weight of it still felt unbearable. After hours of deliberation, I composed a message to Emma. It was brief, deliberate, and to the point. I attached the photos and video, ensuring that no part of her betrayal could be misconstrued or denied. The message read simply, I know everything. Don't bother coming up with excuses. I hit send, my heart pounding as I waited for her response. It didn't take long. Within minutes, my phone lit up with a flood of messages and calls from Emma. Her initial response was denial, claiming that it wasn't what it looked like, that I was misunderstanding the situation. But as the reality of the evidence set in, her tone shifted. Her messages turned frantic, filled with pleas for forgiveness. She called repeatedly, leaving voicemails where her voice cracked with emotion. She swore it was a mistake, that it hadn't meant anything, that she loved me and wanted to fix things. She begged me to come home, to talk to her, to give her a chance to explain. But there was nothing to explain. I'd seen the truth with my own eyes, and no amount of apologies could undo what she'd done. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded everything to my lawyer, explaining the situation and requesting to begin the divorce proceedings immediately. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I knew there was no coming back from this. The betrayal was too deep, the trust too thoroughly shattered. When Emma realized I wasn't answering her calls, she sent a flurry of texts, alternating between begging for forgiveness and accusing me of overreacting. She claimed she'd been caught up in the moment, that Mark meant nothing to her, that she'd been feeling neglected and had made a mistake. But her words rang hollow, a desperate attempt to salvage what she'd already destroyed. He stayed firm. The papers were drawn up quickly, thanks to the overwhelming evidence I'd provided. When Emma was served, she called me in tears, begging me to reconsider. She promised to end things with Mark, to go to therapy, to do whatever it took to rebuild our marriage. But I told her it was too late. The trust we'd built over 12 years, the life we'd shared, it was gone. She'd made her choice, and now I was making mine. The days that followed were a blur of logistical details and emotional fallout. Emma moved out of the house, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and regret. Mark, predictably, disappeared from the picture entirely, his charm no longer useful now that the damage was done. Looking back, the most painful part wasn't the affair itself. It was the realization that the woman I thought I knew, the partner I'd trusted with my heart, had chosen to betray me in such a deliberate and selfish way. The divorce was finalized quickly, and as I walked out of the courthouse, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for what we'd lost, for the life we could have had. But relief that I was finally free from the lies, the deception, and the weight of a marriage that had become a facade.